Well, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the second live panel of 2025 for EcoOnline's Situation Room. I'm David Picton. I'll be your host for the day. I'm our Senior Vice President of ESG and Safety. And we've got some fantastic guests and a brilliant subject to cover for you today. Now, this is part of a series that we're running every month throughout the year. Wherever you're joining us from in the world or whether you're watching it on catch-up, I hope there's something of use for you there. The Situation Room itself is a thought leadership forum. It's all about engagement, really. It's a community. And this is an article we're talking about today that we've had running since the start of April. It's a chance today to ask questions or chat to our panel. So there's a Q&A capability. Please do use that. If you've got questions that you would like to ask us, please ask that. We've got some other questions coming in as well. The focus today is going to be, is health and safety modern enough for a modern world? It's maybe a day of reckoning in some ways for health and safety. Now, the fantastic panel we've got with us today, we've got Emma McDonald joining us, the International Head of Safety at Amazon. We've got Brandon Rashkovsky, who's the Director and Founder of the Safety Knights, a fantastic organization based out of North America. We've got Dr. Richard Tipper, who's the Chief Scientific Officer here at EcoOnline. And as I said, I'm David Picton. Now, modern workplaces, of course, present quite a different set of health and safety risks and considerations compared to the workplaces, say, of 70 years ago. Now, 70 years ago is when most of the major frameworks and legislation were shaped and introduced. So we've come a long way over those 7 decades or so. We've got a much more diverse workforce, different characteristics of age, gender diversity, accessibility needs. We've got more temporary labour in some cases, perhaps the gig economy, as sometimes it's referred to, with training, language and literacy challenges in some cases. We've got remote and hybrid work. We've got that work outside traditional business settings in some ways, in quite uncontrolled environments. We've had a proliferation of new technology and devices, bringing different ergonomic risks and connectivity stress. We've also got new environmental hazards with new chemicals and even the effects of climate change, if you like, in terms of heat and flooding. And then finally, of course, corporate cultures have changed with changing generational attitudes and cultural expectations. So the workplaces are very different. Has health and safety tracked those changes and kept up to date is what we're going to be looking at today. So to our headline question, how have you seen organisations adopting modern health and safety approaches to meet modern workplaces? And Emma, I wonder if I could turn to you first.
You absolutely can. Hi, everybody. So I guess certainly from my perspective, the most obvious thing that I see is people shifting away from manual solutions. And I know that sounds such like a tiny thing, but it's not. You know, I work in obviously one of the biggest companies in the world, and everybody's shifting to modern technologies. It's quite a large feat when you're a large company. That being said, it's equally hard when you're a small company. But changing away from those manual solutions, away from Excel into something that allows us to track and monitor safety reactively and proactively, I think it's a huge turning point it gives us data in the first instance. And then you layer on top of that things like digital systems to track site access. So, you know, if I were to work on a construction site, for example, rather than traditionally signing in the book, being able to have somebody biometrically scan my face to know I've come on site, to know how many hours I've worked. We don't know how many hours we've worked. We don't know. We can put our safety rates together. So that plus camera tech, AI, geofencing, they're probably the ones that I see as the most fundamental and most obvious in-phase stuff that for me in my role and others that make a difference.
Brilliant, thanks, Emma. And Brandon, if I could turn to you and ask a similar question, how have you seen organisations adopting modern health and safety approaches to meet modern workplaces?
Yeah, and thank you for the opportunity to respond to that. It's a great question, right? And we're seeing certainly a lot of organizations moving from a reactive approach to a more proactive one at that, using data analytics, wearables. You know, we've seen, as you mentioned, AI-powered tools that's starting to become a lot more in the forefront. But we're also seeing the shift in the focus on some more mature organizations, now even starting to focus on things like mental health, psychosocial risk, whereas, you know, earlier on it was all about compliance. And I think a lot of organizations have moved past that and they're using tech to to focus on those up and coming things, right? Especially in the wake of a lot more workplace violence issues, a lot more burnout, less labor force, things that we're seeing here, at least in the United States, if not globally, right? So those are some good systems there. Digital permits to work, as you mentioned, geofencing. Those are all great tools that we're starting to see being implemented across larger and even smaller organizations.
Brilliant. Thanks, Brandon. Well, that's actually perhaps one area we could dive down in terms of technology. If we just expanded that slightly and look at how is technology changing perhaps safe choices in modern workplaces. And Richard, I wonder if I could turn to you then, how technology is changing those safe choices.
Well, I think as you've already mentioned that there's been massive advances in the application of technology in health and safety, and that is going to continue into the future. And I think, harking back a bit to our previous month's topic on AI, I think everybody these days is talking about AI and how AI is going to transform things. I think the interesting thing about technology introductions is that often there's sometimes a gap between what people expect and what people actually obtain. And one of the real challenges, I think, for the profession is implementing new technologies in a safe way and understanding what their limits of a given context are, what the kind of blind spots of a given technology might be, or what the specific cultural or group of people that you're working with, how they might use that technology, or how they might, maybe misinterpret the technology. So I think with new technology always comes new opportunities, but also there's also the potential for gaps there, and people not fully understanding the new technology or expecting it to be better or different than it actually is. So I think yes, it's a lot of that is all about how that is implemented, how it's tested, how it's reviewed by the relevant teams, and to some extent, I think the professionals' role is evolving into kind of very much a kind of technology enabler, technology tester, technology validator, and feeding back, on the experience of their uses. So it's very interesting period. I expect that to continue at pace.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. And Emma, I wonder if I could pick up the similar question with you. You mentioned the technology side of things, geofencing particularly. How have you seen that changing the sort of safe choices that people might make off the back of that technology, if you like?
So it's probably a twofold response here, because I think the most, again, going really broadly, making safe choices, I think the one thing about that is making choices easier, full stop. We've now got data to be able to allow us to make actual informed decisions rather than something that's based on gut instinct, which, and let's face it, we're human, a lot of us do that, but now we have the actual data to do the right thing. We can see emerging trends, which subsequently allow us to put the mitigations in and so on and so forth. So I think, across the board, for me, what Safe Choices is allowing is the enabler is data. And I think that extends to any facet of the digital, let's say, the digital solutions that we might have, whether that is geofencing or whatnot. I mean, again, from a geofencing perspective, it's not like you didn't know what part wasn't safe. Now you can physically see it, not just guessing, oh, hold on, I need to be a meter away or 6 meters away from that. It's actually, apart from the physical fencing, there's geofencing. So it's just transparency at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Allows us to make the informed decision.
Brilliant. Thanks for building that out for us as well. If we could stray on a little bit away from the technology for a second, I think we touched on legislation briefly there. And I'd just like to ask the panel now, to what extent or how well do we think health and safety legislation, if you like, is keeping pace with the modern workplace? Brandon, I wonder if we could turn to you first for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in a broad answer, right, that legislation is going to depend on who's actually doing the legislating, right? So if I'm talking globally, it's going to change from country to country. But even here where I live in the United States, it's very different even from a state to state basis, as well as there's even, certain local types of pressures, right? But, we're seeing it in a global standpoint. We're seeing countries like Australia, Canada, they've introduced some psychosocial safety guidelines, which I think is probably one of the more proactive things I've seen. The EU has also really started to emphasize those mental health risks in the workplace. And I think, back to the United States, I think a lot of, what is driving activities is a lot on the legislative side. Certainly there's those cost benefits and the ROIs as well. When you look at, maybe some pressures to improve ergonomic programs or, removing or reducing injury rates, right, from a cost benefit. But certainly, there's some legislative pieces there that really do kind of move the needle in a big way. And I think here we probably need a lot more of it, right? Because I think we're lagging behind from a global perspective when it comes to certain regions or countries. But I think we have some room to improve there.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks. And Richard, I wonder if I could turn for the same sort of question to you, really, and what you've seen in terms of health and safety or related legislation keeping pace with that modern workplace and some of the modern risks as well. Yeah,
well, looking at the data, my understanding is that the record in the UK and Europe is considerably better in terms of lower rates of injury and fatalities in the workplace than in the US, and I think it's interesting to look at what might be underneath that and whether the way that regulation works is part of that. I think that the way that regulation works in the US is more prescriptive on specific things that have to be done in specific situations and types of work, whereas the work here in the UK situation, and I think in other parts of Europe, it's more systems approach and more guidance based. Where there is a kind of discretion and a requirement on the responsible business to assess the methods and assess what is appropriate in a given situation. And I think it's probably bearing out that more flexible approach seems to be the one that's generating safer environments. I mean, I would be interested to know very much if there are specific differences where the more prescriptive approach does work better, and it may do in certain circumstances of certain niche businesses. But I suspect that the overall development of this more flexible approach, it's more able to take on board new technologies and changes to the work itself, rather than constantly playing catch up about specific things that need to be done, possibly with technology that was out of date. And that would be that prescriptive approach is very difficult to keep up to date. But I think there's probably a live debate going on that, and I'd be very interested to hear more about that situation.
Yeah, I think I agree, definitely. And as you say, a lot of that major legislation framed and shaped around 70 years ago, where there was a lot more centralised work, a lot less remote workers, if you like, and certainly a lot less remote connectivity. And we're certainly seeing, I think, in some cases, aren't we, the ability for remote workers to be able to access live data, live safety data sheets, for example, in the chemical context, whereas they would have to have taken that with them from the workplace if they were going to go out and do some remote work. So it's that idea of instant connectivity and instant connections, I think, is definitely helping to shape some of that legislation that needs to frame it around that way and keep up with it as well. Okay, we actually have an interesting question coming in, Emma, which I wonder if I might direct towards you. We had a question come in about more diverse workforces. I think Amazon particularly is an extremely diverse workplace when you think of the span of territories and different sectors and areas that you cover and are connected with. So the question is, how well are organisations adapting to more diverse workforces?
Yes, I totally love this question. I love this question mostly because I'm not just the head of safety, I'm also the head of DEI as well. So
fantastic.
The question almost is like common sense, and I think that the best thing here is it gives let's put it this way. Diverse workforces is just the opportunity. It doesn't need to be DEI. It doesn't need to be anything else. It just needs to be common sense. And finally, it's prevailing. So, when you look through a diversity lens, let's say, for example, around, I don't know, PPE. Finally, PPE is now designed to fit women or to fit different body shapes and sizes or cultural needs. I think I was on a construction site last week. And the versions of PPE are... It's enormous to fit the cultural population, whatever that might be. I think then you layer on top of that something like diverse risk assessments. Again, same thing. It's just recognizing one size doesn't fit all. If somebody is going, and again, I'm using construction sites as an option here, but if somebody was going to a construction site, let's just say it was a pregnant woman, then again, same thing. You need to have a different kind of risk assessment to somebody else going to site, or anybody who may have a disability of some description. It recognises things like harassment that might be received potentially by minority groups, whatever format they come in. So I think having those kind of risk assessments, it raises awareness. And then on top of that, you could raise awareness that having that diverse workforce. And you mentioned Amazon, obviously, we're 1.6 million people, might be 1.8 million people, just inside our company without any contractors. So, we have to consider all these kind of things. And, working even with the vendors that we work with, it's interesting to watch them go through different types of training to recognize the cultural differences. But whether it's the most obvious stuff, like language, literacy, cultural sensitivities, and then you layer on top of that things like psychological safety, knowing to keep everybody feeling comfortable to talk about risks and therefore incidents in the world of safety. So I think organisations absolutely are adapting, and all right, there's a whole different topic as to DEI across the board, but I think if you just layer in common sense, this is just allowing people to recognise what potentially they may or may not see. There are differences, and we can accept whatever that might be, and we can adapt safety to make sure it's not a one size fits all.
Yeah, brilliant. I think that's great, especially as you say, that not one size fits all. I remember as a chief safety officer in the construction context, as well as you say, how diverse the workforces were. We were doing a lot of work, particularly in the Middle East as well, and we were drawing workers there from all kinds of different nations, really, and having to take account of that difference in understanding and the difference in way in which people learn as well. So, ways that they might engage. Toolbox talk, for example, something like that.
Absolutely.
Really brings that to life.
When you do that and you allow that to happen, you realise that the way that you know, which might be bloody brilliant, actually there's always opportunities for it to be improved if you could just listen to the diversity of the workforce, and everybody's voice matters.
Brilliant. Thanks, Emma. Brandon, another question that's come in here, and this is one I wonder if we could send in your direction, really. We've got a question: how are organisations shifting a focus, preventing accidents, and perhaps towards a wider investment in well-being and productivity, for example?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and I'll reference the Heat Safety Summit that Safety Nights just put on roughly a month ago, and thank you again, Richard and David, for being a part of that. I absolutely loved your presentation, especially on the climate risk and the technologies that your team has developed along those lines. But we're also seeing yes, there's a safety benefit there. But what we're also seeing is, for example, take into account like mining. We're seeing, due to hydration loss over time in a high degree, that brain function is actually decreasing over the span of people's work lives. And we're starting to see companies come out with proactive patches that can monitor electrolyte loss, in a more function of productivity, right? Because they are understanding that dehydrated workers are not functioning at the same level or capacity of ones that are properly hydrated and well rested. We're also seeing companies like United Airlines and Russell Pink gave a great talk on it at the Heat Safety Summit. But they're starting to use some heat technologies that really are finding their baggage handlers, right, when they're getting overheated, are not being able to keep up with the pace, right? And so we're starting to see that, there's, even just in the case of heat exhaustion, there's that added benefit of productivity there too.
Yeah, that's fascinating. If I just want to add on to that, I saw there was some interesting controversial, so somewhat controversial item that came in the news the other day about line speeds in poultry slaughterhouses and pig slaughterhouses being increased, in a way to kind of try to address food security and food prices in the US, and the issue of that productivity gains being sought by the companies, and they're being kind of pushed back on a safety basis from some of the unions, and how new technologies such as AI, which is supposed to enhance throughput, also being said, oh, we'll make it safe with AI, and there's a very interesting kind of set of things there where you see certain businesses under intense commercial pressure to increase throughputs in ways that could push people to the limits of certain things, and new technology is apparently going to solve the problem, but we're not 100% sure yet. So I think there's a very interesting ongoing area to keep watch on there.
Yeah, and to Emma's point earlier, so making good decisions, like, hey, we know inherently that well-rested, stress-free workers are more productive, but now we can actually put the data behind it and make those good decisions.
Yeah, in fact, I wonder if we could just build on that for a second, that question really there, and perhaps look at more hybrid and remote working and different work patterns. You started to talk about different work patterns as well there. Richard, if I could just turn to you, how effectively do you think organisations are taking account of those different work patterns now?
Well, I mean, hybrid work became a massive thing, of course, in the COVID pandemic, and all sorts of businesses have adapted to this. And I think in general, it's amazing how productive businesses have remained in that changing circumstance. Of course, there's a lot of jobs that can't be done hybrid, where you need the person in the place at a given time. I think we're in a very interesting era where there are certain people who is just sort of immersed in the hybrid workspace. They couldn't imagine doing anything else. What are the health and safety requirements of somebody who's working from home or working from a coffee shop or working with different things? I think we're still in a kind of early stages of that. Obviously, most of the people who are doing this hybrid work aren't sort of doing what one might classically call high-risk jobs, but we might see coming down the line at some point, issues of people feeling that they haven't been properly supported in remote working, and what those expectations would have been, and what the reasonable, the reasonable actions of the employer should have been. I mean, I think it's an interesting and still an early developing kind of area of health and safety.
We've had another question come in, which is interesting, really. This is talking about how technology can effectively prevent human factors from circumventing systems. So human factors, people going around systems, if you like. Emma, I wonder if I could turn to you now, and just the question really is how would we get employees to consistently and effectively engage with the technology so that they are making those safer choices? We sort of touched on this a little bit, I think, how we can get that consistent engagement.
Yeah, look, I think deploying any technology is never easy. I think the people who buy in or invent or create or whatever that part of technology always think it's super easy, but it's consistency at the end of the day. I think it's a top-down message. It's like anything, whether it's technology or a policy or a procedure, it has to start top-down. You need your leadership to be utilising that said tool, policy, whatever it might be, and be seen to doing it. I mean, for us in Amazon, if anybody else who knows Amazon, we measure living daylights out of anything and everything. So, you know, you have to be prescriptive about what you're doing. You have to show people this is what you want to do. You write a policy about it. You design how you measure it. You do something, you consistently measure it, and then you look at what's not working, and then you go back and recreate that. And quite frankly, you know, there's an element of people on a bell curve will just early adopt whatever it is that's coming, but you need those mechanisms in place to make sure that all the others who are not the early adopters, who might be a bit more pessimistic about whatever it might be, whether it's technology or a new process and procedure, that they will do it regardless. And again, when you're working at scale and volume, it's an absolute necessity. It's the only way. People don't have to love it, because you're absolutely right. They are going to avoid it mostly at all costs. They'll have their own way of doing it. They will think that's better. Maybe they don't see the bigger picture, and it's not because there's anything wrong with that. It's just because that's the way that they're working, and maybe don't recognize the long-term benefits. So again, persistence and consistency, I think, is the only way to get around people avoiding a topic.
Yeah, that's very true. And again, I refer back to my time as a chief safety officer. A couple of things came to mind for me. The idea of how we get technology people to engage with the technology. A couple of things that were important for us were making sure that if we were choosing new technologies, new software, and new devices, we included people from the workforce level in making the choice. You know, and in fact, yeah, in a lot of our RFPs and tenders, there was a high scoring allowance, if you like, for whether the employees liked the device. You know, did they like the form factor, the buttons, the way it worked, you know, and if there were ancillaries, accessories and holsters and things, you know, did that work for them on a daily basis?
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was sort of chosen by them.
Yeah, and maybe I did touch on that, so it's a good point. I guess I'm just going at the mechanism. When I'm taking you know, as we often do, certainly in my role, there are so many people to accommodate. You know, there's the bell curve of the nice stuff, the easy stuff that gets the first adopters in there kind of quickly. But people will always find an excuse for everything. It is human nature, but you can mitigate with 100 million different versions of how to do that. But I do think it's consistency and persistence, because otherwise, if you're not using it, it can easily. I've seen too many systems or technologies that have just faded into the background because people have got this, it's the perfect solution.
Yeah.
But they have been consistent in showing the benefit to the everyone, and how they're forcing data out of it, and how they're using that data to make certain decisions. And for us, in my role, if it's not in there, it didn't happen. If it's not in there, you're not getting any more headcount. If it's not in there, it's kind of like we channel everything through. We make it, let's say, we try and close all the doors to make sure you go that route, whether you again, we're talking about a bell curve of the people who are really hard to get through, but it needs to be considered. I think there's an element of considering the people at the end who don't want to do this. You can think that how to get them onto something new, it's easier than the early adopters. That they're the ones who can fix that problem first. The rest is easy.
Yeah. I wonder if we could pick up another quick question come in here as well, which is useful. Brandon, I think if we could send you, it touched on something you mentioned a couple of times, I think, as well. How you know, health safety is traditionally focused on physical risks in a lot of cases, really, but how effectively do we see organisations now starting to address mental health, if you like, and the associated risks around that?
Yeah, and I think so. Back when I was an EHS manager, the companies that I had worked for or been around, it wasn't quite there yet. It wasn't a thing that we were really talking about at the time. But I'm really starting to hear a lot more of that come up in recent conversations, especially because I do a lot of work on social media. It's how I get the word out about safety nights and the different things that we're doing. But I'm starting to see that become a more trending topic in discussions amongst EHS professionals. Again, still kind of on the early stages here, but I think most organizations acknowledge that mental health is important, whether it's from a safety perspective or an HR perspective. I think there's at least something there, but I think there's still like a big gap between the intent of an organization to focus on it and how well they're actually doing it, right? And I think a lot of leadership within companies are starting to catch on in that realm. They're talking about burnout, stress, mental health, which is a huge cultural shift, really, from where we were a few years back, even. And that's starting to translate, I think, into those more proactive strategies. So, mental health training for managers, anonymous pulse checks. I know that a lot of organizations have those surveys. Whether they're executing them well or not is another point of contention. But they're starting to do that a lot more. We've talked about the hybrid flexibility, allowing workers to work from home when they can. Like, again, not everybody can do that, but some can. And we're also starting to just see even some frameworks like ISO 45003. So that's specifically on psychosocial hazard requirements, and we're seeing that in some of the more proactive regions being adopted, right? So enforcement's still light, but a lot of companies are treating these risks as, I think probably like an integrated partnership with health and safety and HR. So we are starting to see that, but I think there's still, again, there's some struggles there, but we're starting to see it actually go in the right direction.
Brilliant. Thanks, Brandon. Well, we're almost at time, really. Just a couple of minutes, really. Now, I wonder if we could just wrap that up. The last question, really, just to you to ask, really, is what evolution or changes do you see coming next in health and safety management, if we're talking about keeping it modern? Richard, I wonder if we could finish up with you.
Yeah, well, I suppose at my age, I think a lot about what the next generation are going to be defining as safe, and what kind of workplaces they want to work in and will work productively in. I think they're coming into the world of work from a slightly different position than my generation did. We were sort of happy to take on jobs and sort of do them in 9 to 5, and we sort of do the grind. I think there's a lot more people have different expectations from work. They approach work with a different mental mindset, and I think that's an area that we, as health and safety people, really need to kind of grapple with. And I'm not quite sure how to do it, but maybe that's a problem for the next generation.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you to both in terms of keeping them safe, but actually managing and tracking safety themselves, becoming part of the profession. Emma, any final thoughts from you on what evolution or changes you might see coming next in health and safety?
Yeah, look, similar to Richard, I think there's an element of making sure that the next generation understand the purpose of safety. We've spent 30 odd years getting to this point, and it just seems common sense to most people. But the next generation need purpose, and need to almost go backwards a little bit. So, I mean, for me, and the next level of purpose for me is seeing the human right that's being built into safety. Where there are safety problems, there are human rights issues. And when you put parallel, when you look at the data, it's there. It's just we're not looking. And quite frankly, I don't think we can wait another 30 years to sort that problem out. But it also fits nicely, let's say, with the purpose of the next generation. I think the sooner that we start tying those, I mean, we have an ESG, but I think the more it becomes day to day, that you look at one thing, you see the other as well at the same time. I mean, I'd love to see it do that, and I hope it does.
Brilliant, thanks. And Brandon, any final thought from you?
Yeah, I think I think also we're starting to see with the next generation, the challenge of not even how safety is done, but who's owning it. Right. And I think, traditionally, hey, there used to be like a safety person on site, and it's their responsibility for safety. But when it becomes everyone's responsibility and people are empowered and actually integrated into the process, you'll start to see more success within organizations. And we're starting to see a lot of, I think we're starting to see that change a lot more, where more people are part of it. But I think it's going to be really crucial with, and I know I'm a millennial, but no longer the youngest generation in the workplace. I think there's that empowerment, that need for empowerment in decision-making processes and transparency, right, that they're looking for.
Brilliant. Well, that's great. Well, surprisingly, that's gone incredibly quick. Thank you so much. We've covered an awful lot there. Thank you, Emma. Thanks, Brandon, and thank you, Richard, as well, for sharing your thoughts and your experiences. And thanks to everyone who's joined us. Hopefully, that gives you something to take back to your workplaces and get a conversation going, if you like, about whether health and safety really is modern enough for that modern workplace. And please keep in touch with us in the Situation Room. And if we didn't get to one of your questions, just get onto the community, put the question on there, and we'll keep the debate going. So thank you, and we'll see you next time.